bet you didn't know that in the 70s, high school sex education was arguably more progressive than it is today. Yeah. Sex ed is so limited in today's schools, in fact, that 28 states don't even require it to be taught. And only 13 states require that sex ed instruction be medically accurate, mostly meaning that it should be accurate about the effectiveness of condoms. And with teen pregnancy and STI rates in the US substantially higher than in other developed countries, maybe it's time for a sex ed revolution. But just how did sex ed in the US get so bad in the first place? Well, the first sex ed curriculum, called sex hygiene classes, was introduced in 1913 in Chicago by a woman named Ella Flagg Young, who was also the first female superintendent of schools in the city. Unfortunately for Young and her students, the Catholic Church didn't like this very much and put an end to her program after only 1 year. It wasn't until the US entered World War I that the government realized it had a major problem, or rather, its troops did. The Army lost a total of 7 million working days from soldiers suffering from STIs, which back then was called VD, or venereal disease, and a total of 10,000 soldiers were discharged for having them. The White House concluded that so many American soldiers wouldn't have contracted STIs had they been better educated about sex. In the 20s, upwards of 40% of American public schools started teaching sex ed, which coincidentally developed just as the film industry was taking off. As Hollywood boomed, so did sex ed films. Then in the 30s, the US Office of Education began publishing materials and training teachers on how to teach sex ed.
We must continue this important work of education and forget our prudish attitude towards sex.
Then in 1944, at the height of World War II, came the mass production of penicillin, saving troops everywhere suffering from STIs. Fast forward 16 years when the FDA approved the pill in 1960 for widespread use. It was the beginning of the sexual revolution. Of course, Americans' newfound sexuality didn't come without backlash. In 1968, a pamphlet called "Is the Schoolhouse the Proper Place to Teach Raw Sex?" started appearing in public schools.
This moral decay weakens our resistance to the onslaught of the communist masters of deceit.
And yet, 1970s curriculum featured some of the most explicit films found in sex ed classes, ones they wouldn't likely show in today's classrooms.
Many different kinds of feelings can cause an erection.
But by the late 70s, the conservative right started influencing some parents to protest the curriculum. And then in 1981, the Reagan administration introduced the Adolescent Family Life Act. This law, which put a ton of funding towards sex ed programs that promoted abstinence, was the single biggest influencer on modern-day sex ed curriculum. But research showed that abstinence-only programs that gained popularity in the 80s and 90s didn't work. Teens still had just as much sex, and states with abstinence-only education had the highest rates of teen pregnancies. In fact, a 2008 study reported that teens who received comprehensive sex education were 60% less likely to get pregnant than those who received abstinence-only education. So in 2010, Obama cut funding for abstinence-only programs by 2/3. And for the first time ever, the government began funding comprehensive sex ed programs. You know, ones that actually talked about contraception. Today, both abstinence-only sex ed and more comprehensive sex ed are equally funded by the government. But with only 18 states and the District of Columbia requiring those kinds of comprehensive classes, is it time to teach all students what they really need to know about sex?
So you want to go to grad school, but you aren't sure whether it's worth it.